In this episode of What's Going On in Life Science, we're going to be talking about the 6 kingdoms of life. That's right, all life is categorized into 6 kingdoms, and you're going to know how each kingdom is divided up and which characteristics each kingdom contains. So, let's get started with our notes today. So here we are with our 6 Kingdoms of Life slideshow and the notes that you're going to be taking. So at the same time as walking through these slides, you are going to be adding to your PDF of the 6 Kingdoms of Life notes. So let's get it started here. We've had a lesson on taxonomy already, and it was those different levels of classification. I think you'll remember this. Yeah, that should have been familiar to you. The way that the taxonomy works, we're going to first start with the largest level, and that is the domain. Every living organism fits under these 3 domains. We have the first one, A, as being bacteria, the next one, B, as being something known as archaea, and the third one being the largest, being eukarya. Those 3 classification systems contain every living organism that's ever been identified, and even the ones that haven't been identified fall underneath those 3 domains. Now, from those 3 domains, we move into the kingdoms. We are going to talk about 6 different kingdoms. Sometimes you'll hear that there's a 5 kingdom system because some scientists classify bacteria and archaea together. For our purposes, we're going to talk about 6 kingdoms. So our first kingdom that falls underneath our bacteria domain is the bacteria kingdom. So not very creative in naming that kingdom. They just use the same domain. Luckily, the only thing that's in that kingdom are bacteria. In the next kingdom we have is archaea, and that falls underneath the archaea domain. So you can see how bacteria and archaea are not only their own domains, they're their own kingdoms. Eukarya, however, contains 4 of the 6 kingdoms. So we have the first one is the kingdom of protists or protista. The next one is plantae or plants. The third one is fungi. And the fourth is animalia or the animals. You might have been wondering why I said protista, plantae, fungi, and animalia. That's because that's their Latin names. All right, so we have these 6 kingdoms: archaea, bacteria, protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. These 6 kingdoms are defined by 3 different ways of being classified. The first type is by their type of cells. There's 2 characteristics that we will talk about. If you look at those 6 pictures there, archaea bacteria and eubacteria, archaea and bacteria, have a word underneath them called prokaryote. That is one of the ways that these kingdoms are divided up in how items are classified. The other 4 have something called eukaryote. So those are the different types of cells. The second way that things are classified is how many cells they have. Some of these organisms are single-celled and some of them are multi-celled. We'll talk about that vocabulary in just a slide or 2. And then finally, the third way of how they're classified is how they obtain energy. Do they obtain energy from the sun, or do they consume other organisms? We're going to get into some vocab that you might have had earlier in some of your 5th grade and even elementary school teachings. Okay, the first way that things are classified are by their type of cells. And we have 2 different types of cells that we're going to be talking about. The first one is prokaryotic, or these are known as the prokaryotes. This is what a typical prokaryotic cell would look like. These are your bacteria and your archaea. They are prokaryotes, and what makes them prokaryotic is that these cells do not have a nucleus. They're not as well defined as other cells. They do have DNA, however. You can see the DNA there in the red. That's the genetic material. That's how a bacteria knows how to clone itself to become another bacteria. These prokaryotic cells have a cell wall. It keeps and contains all of the stuff inside the cell because there, besides DNA, there's things like cytoplasm and ribosomes inside there. So it has to be contained somehow, so they have a cell wall holding all that information in. And another way you can think of these cells as being basic. They're not as complex as the other type of cell, which is the eukaryotic cell, or the eukaryotes. Eukaryotic cells are a lot more complex. Go ahead and take a look at all the different names for the organelles inside that cell. Organelles are the different types of, you can think of it like your own organs. Those organs function together to make that cell work, and there's a lot of different things functioning there to make this eukaryotic cell work. What makes it eukaryotic? The main difference is having a nucleus. They also have DNA or genetic material, and that genetic material is inside that nucleus, that round shape that you see in that picture. These cells have many organelles. Just take a look at the list of names on both sides of that picture. Those are all things that you're going to come to know later on in the year. And these types of cells are very complex. The next way that organisms are classified is by the number of cells they contain. So we could have unicellular or single-celled organisms. These organisms are one cell big. So here is a blepharisma, which is a type of protist. It is a single-celled organism. All the different functions of life, all the characteristics of life, take place inside one cell. This cell breathes, exchanges gases, gets rid of waste, eats, gets energy. All the things that something alive does happens inside one cell. So one cell performing all the different characteristics of life. So if we have our unicellular, I'm guessing you can guess what the next one is. That's multicellular. Many different cells together. These are our plants, our fungi, our animals. A collection of cells performing the characteristics of life. Finally, we come to the third way that organisms are classified into their kingdoms, and that's the way they obtain energy. We have what's known as autotrophs, or you might know it from previous school years as being a producer. These are our plants. Anything that has chlorophyll, chloroplast inside of it, making its own food. So it makes or produces its own food through a process that you should know as photosynthesis, taking energy from the sun, turning it into food, turning it into glucose and sugar so that those organisms can get their energy. The other way is by being a heterotroph or a consumer. These organisms take other organisms and use them as food. You could not only eat other animals, but plants as well. So animals can eat other animals can eat plants, animals can eat both. These organisms use or they consume other organisms for their energy. Sometimes we've got organisms that are both. Can you think of any organisms that can make its own food and can eat other organisms? You may not know any of these organisms yet, but we will study these a little bit later on in life. For example, we've got these what's known as euglena. These euglena are moving protists that can go around and absorb food, eat other organisms, but you can see the green inside them. They also have chloroplasts. They produce their own food as well. Other things that obtain energy are fungi. Fungi are heterotrophs, meaning they eat or use other organisms for food. They decompose their food. Fungi can also be parasitic and infect other organisms and live inside them. This ant, for example, has a fungus that was living inside of it, using it as food, and in time, eventually, as you can see from this ant, the fungus grew out of this ant and spread its spores. So here we are. We're at our last part where you're going to build a visual that's going to help you remember what all these different kingdoms look like and what their characteristics are. So in just a moment, I'm going to start building this with you, and you're going to use the items inside the folder, or you can go on Safari and use pictures of your own to help fill in this chart. All right, so those were all of our notes, and before we get started with our visual that we're going to build today, if you haven't done so already, there are 6 photographs that you can use for this assignment. You can take those photographs and put them in your camera roll, or you can go get your own from Safari. It's totally up to you. There's also the PDF that should be in Notability that you should have taken notes on already, and those notes should be completed, and now it's time to complete our visual to help you with all the 3 ways that these organisms are classified. So here's our visual we're going to work on for the day. I'm going to be cutting here and there in order to save you some time, and we're going to fill in this in chunks. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in my 6 kingdoms from bottom to top. So I've labeled my kingdoms from bottom to top: bacteria, archaea, protist, fungi, plant, and animal. I gave certain kingdoms certain colors. For example, the plant kingdom I think of as being green. The protist kingdom is also known as the water kingdom, so it's blue. Fungi, I think of breaking dead organisms down, so I made it black. And I also left some room for the pictures I'm going to insert. So after I insert my pictures, then you can go ahead and fill in your chart. And through the power of editing, I have added in 6 pictures that will help remind me of each of these kingdoms as well. I put in a picture of a single bacteria down there. The archaea has a certain picture of what is known as a grand prismatic spring. I'll explain why in just a little bit. I put a picture of a bunch of different protists in there. The fungi, first thing you should think of when you think of fungi is mushrooms. I have a nice picture of a flower, a sunflower. If you want to pick a different picture, go ahead. And then one of my favorite animals is an octopus because they are so smart and clever. So I stuck in the octopus as my animal. Feel free to pick your own animal. Our first kingdom of life that we come to are the bacteria. There's a nice picture of a bacterium right there. So we're going to talk about the different ways that a bacteria is classified. So a bacteria is classified by its type of cells, which is prokaryotic, meaning it does not have a nucleus. They are also classified by their number of cells. Bacteria are unicellular, single-celled organisms. And then finally, bacteria are both autotrophs and heterotrophs. Some of them create their own energy, others have to absorb their own energy. Our next kingdom of life are the archaea. Archaea, just like bacteria, are prokaryotic. They do not have a nucleus. They are also unicellular, one-celled organisms, and they are both autotrophs and heterotrophs. Well, how do we tell the difference between these? Well, archaea and bacteria are both types of bacteria. Bacteria is also known as eubacteria, and archaea is known as archaeobacteria. The different ways that they are classified is depending on their environment. For example, regular eubacteria, bacteria, are made a certain way and they live on certain surfaces and in certain areas. Just like archaea, they live in certain areas and on certain surfaces. Archaea are known as extremophiles. These type of archaea are probably the first known types of bacteria to have inhabited the earth. These live, and that's why the picture I have there is of the Grand Prismatic Spring. That is a very hot and hostile environment. But all those different colors that you see around that spring, those are different types of archaea bacteria. Depending on how hot the water is, depends on what type of archaea bacteria lives there, giving it the color that it gives. We'll talk more about these differences in our next lesson. Our next kingdom of life are the protists. Protists are the first kingdom that we're going to come to where their types of cells are eukaryotic. These cells have a nucleus. These single-celled organisms, unicellular, have a nucleus. One cell doing all of the things that any living organism can do. These organisms are very unique where they can be both autotrophic, heterotrophic, or a combination of the two. They can be both at the same time. There are some protists that can be multicellular, and it's only really one type of protist, and that protist is kelp. Kelp is a multicellular protist that grows in the oceans. Moving on to our fungi kingdom. Our fungi kingdom are eukaryotic. They have a nucleus. The fungi, as far as how many cells they're made up of, are mostly multicellular. There are some single-celled organisms, and those organisms are what we refer to as yeasts. And then fungi are heterotrophic. They break down other organisms and use other organisms as their source of energy. Our fifth kingdom on our list of kingdoms is the plant kingdom. Plants are eukaryotic. They have a nucleus, or all their cells have a nucleus. These organisms are multicellular. They are complex organisms, and they are autotrophic. These organisms make their own food. Now, some people would argue, what about things like a Venus flytrap or a pitcher plant that does consume other organisms? Yes, there are rare occasions that do consume other organisms, but they also make their own food. So we're going to call this entire kingdom as being autotrophic. And at the top of our 6 kingdoms of life chart, we have the animal kingdom. This is the kingdom you belong to. All of your cells are eukaryotic, complex cells that have nucleuses or nuclei. These animals are multicellular, and they are heterotrophic. All animals have to consume other organisms, whether that's plants or fungi or other animals, for food. So there you have it. Those are the 6 kingdoms of life, how they're classified, and why they're classified the way that they are. You can use these notes now in further assignments and on quizzes to help you when being asked why a protist is a protist, or a fungi is a fungi, or an animal is an animal. You can use these notes to help you identify them.